Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer, and I am super happy to be hosting another episode today on this podcast. And for those of you who are willing to support the podcast, I'm always encouraged to remind you to donate to the podcast at mormonmentalhealth.org. There's a nice little button there where you can send some money our ways to make this podcast sustainable. If that's something that you'd like to support, we always appreciate that to help us with, things like website fees and editing costs and all the stuff that goes into keeping this going. Other than that, I'd rather just kind of get to the content. So I am super excited to have Brittney Hartley with us today. I've been wanting to interview you for a while now. We've been trying to connect for a few months, if not more. So welcome to the show, Britt. Super happy to have you. And you're joining us from Boise, Idaho. Is that correct?
I am. And I don't know if you remember the first time we met, Natasha. Most people say like, hi, I'm Brittney, nice to meet you. And you were at Sunstone in Boise, and this was years ago. I can't even remember how many years ago. And I grabbed your hands and I said, Natasha, I don't even think I said my name. I said, your work on masturbation saved my brother's life. And you cried, and then I cried, and we just kind of held each other. Because at the time, my brother was seeing a bishop every 2 weeks. And the bishop would ask things like how he's gay and how often did you think about men this week? And we were about to lose my brother. And so your work on masturbation helped my family. And that was the first time we met, and we just cried in each other's arms. And then later on, we kind of met in outside circles, but I don't know if you remember that. That was years ago.
Yes, I actually don't remember that. So
probably because it happens so often, because you're amazing. So it's an honor to be here with you.
Well, it's an honor for you to remind me of that. That's really beautiful and touching. And I'm so glad your brother, I hope, is doing well.
Is flourishing outside of Mormonism at this point, but really flourishing. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. I'm so glad. That's really, really wonderful. Well, you just made my day.
Good. I caught you off guard a little bit. That's good.
That's good. All right. Well, okay. So given that, I'd love to give you the opportunity to tell us about yourself. I'm interested in your professional background because that's a bit of what we're going to talk today about. It's always, I think, a personal journey that leads us to our professional backgrounds. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you think you're.
Yeah. Okay. So put my resume into my story here. So I was raised LDS, and I was kicked out of my home at 16 for having sex before I was married. Super kind of traumatizing time in my life, and kind of was put myself together and became a nuanced Mormon at that point. Around 16, I was doing kind of nuanced Mormonism, nuanced Christianity, really as a way to I needed to find some bridge back to my family. Ended up going to BYU, Idaho. I fell in love with history and the kind of Mormons that history teachers are. It's a different breed of Mormonism, right? So I got my history degree there, and I was a history teacher for many years. I had a faith transition now about 11 years ago. And at the time, there was no Facebook groups and podcasts. It was very isolating. It was very difficult. And in fact, Bill Reel, who I podcast with now, he was the first person in my life to tell me I wasn't broken and that I was growing. And he's a dear friend of mine. And that's one of the reasons. And I just really kind of wanted to better understand faith and faith transitions and religion and God and how this is all part of human nature and separate it all out. So I went and got my master's degree in the future of American religion. So I do have a master's degree in that, and that is really looking at, okay, everybody's deconstructing. Where's this going? What do we do now? That would be the big questions that I really attacked in my master's degree. And now I work as a spiritual director. Just really enjoy the work of, there's lots of kinds of spiritual directors, and we'll get into what that means. But my favorite place to work is I've deconstructed. What now? I have kids. I don't know how to implement rituals into my life because they've all been kind of entangled with some religious trauma, or I don't know what I think about God. I don't know what my meaning of life is. I don't know how to feel connected anymore. That space is really where I like to dive in, both individually as I counsel with people, but also communally. I co-chair a post-Mormon group here in Boise, and I'm interested just as a society and as communities and individually, what happens after deconstruction. So that's the place I like to hang out now.
Okay. And obviously when you're talking about people deconstructing, you're talking about wider than even Mormon.
Yes.
You're talking about the public at large, like the American country at large.
Yeah, we just went to less than 50%, attending church, and, where is this going and what's happening? And this is much bigger than Mormonism, but Mormonism is a part of it. And there's certain things that are unique to Mormonism, and there's certain things that we can share with other people who have deconstructed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so is it okay if I ask a few questions?
Please. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Personal life, and
yeah.
Of course, tell me, butt out at any point. But so you go through this fairly kind of traumatic space in a sexual shame kind of way due to premarital sex. And do you feel like that's something that your family does recover from, and you are able to repair?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how that happens. Is it a softening on your family's part, or is it that you have to do?
So at the time we were, when I was raised, it was a super strict Mormon household, FHE and seminary. We had clean flicks plus like a language blocker on the clean flicks. I mean, it was like, there's no swear words getting into that house, right? And I just really, when the Strength of Youth pamphlet, I'm like 15, I'm starting to think about things, and they gave me the Strength of Youth pamphlet, and just deep in my body, of course I couldn't articulate it like I can now, but as a teenager I just felt this resistance in my body that if this is God who cares about tattoos and coffee, like that can't be God. And I just, I wish that I could have verbalized, kind of what I was feeling, but what it just came out as was rebellion, right? Just a deep in my body rebellion. And so I had sex with my boyfriend, and I got caught, and And at the time, it really broke our family, and it was very hard on my parents, my brothers, and it was very difficult. But in the time since then, the breaking leads to an opening, right? So my brother comes out as gay. The whole foundation of our family really shifts, that we're not going to survive as a family if we're trying to keep this box together because the box is broken. And so we end up really having to repair those relationships. My mom has since left the church. My dad's now a nuanced, active member, and families that are in and out, but not in a contentious way. And so the breaking did for our family, I'm very lucky, led to an opening and a deepening of relationships. And I was able to watch my parents grow and my parents change. In the end, now my parents are, my best friends. But at 16, I wouldn't have said so.
Sure. Yeah, that's really very rigid, right? A very rigid action. And is your brother coming out happening in a similar timeline as what's happening for you?
That would have been a couple years later. He's my youngest brother, and he came out while he was on his mission. But eventually, through that process, and having a gay child is such a gift. It's a hard gift to Mormon families, but it's such a gift because you really have to decide what you're about, and if you're about love or if you're not. It just really opened our family that, hey, this thing that is still feels like it's a good thing for my dad, he began to realize, oh, this isn't a good thing for you. This isn't a good thing for your mental health, and being able to respect him as he pulled away, and to keep a really, really flourishing relationship while that happened. So there was pain and there was a lot of breaking in that kind of a rigid system, but it eventually led to opening and deepening and now relationships. And so those wounds feel very healed to me talking about them now.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So as you talk about this training then that you went to and this deconstruction, and you use words like deconstruction and you use words like religious trauma and things of this nature, can you start telling me how you come across this language and how your training starts interweaving with how your personal experience and now maybe putting professional language to some of that starts informing you not only of your personal experience, but how you want to help others and maybe what you're seeing within your community?
Yeah, so that started very early for me. That was not kind of a new thing. I remember in third grade, we were learning about Native Americans, and I had this really big thought that, wow, these people, their lives look so different than me, but they're just like me. And so at that age, I said, I'm going to be a history teacher because I really want to understand humans, right? And so that quest and that interest has really been a heartbeat in my life. So when I was teaching history, I wasn't teaching about World War II airplanes, although I have many friends who really enjoy that. That's not me personally. When I was teaching history, I just said, yeah, here's some countries and some warplanes, but let's talk about the Holocaust. And let's talk about what it means to be human. And let's look at some of the best and worst ways that we human, right? And I was really always interested in that. And so when I began to really delve into bigger questions, it was always just this drive of trying to understand myself and trying to understand just what it means to be human and what all of this is. And it took me a long time to connect it, but it actually went back to some of that trauma when I was 16 because I'm in my uncle's house. I've been kicked out of my home, and I have this thought, I can't structure my life until I figure out what's the big meaning of life, what's ultimate reality. And so I go on a quest to figure all that out. And eventually I just kind of realized, oh, I'm going to have to construct life even though I don't have great answers to those questions. I'm all but dissertation in a theology degree, and I know less about God than when I started, right? So eventually I had to do a lot of shifting, but it was really just coming out of trauma, that little girl that just wanted to understand the world because I had just been taken away from my family. I had nothing. I knew nobody. How can I build a life until I figure out what life is? And so some of that was wrapped into trauma, but then some of that was just my natural curiosity. And then it was just an individual journey for a long time. And then, began talking to people and getting more and more interested and slowly coming into my own voice and wrapping it around academic language. And it's just been a journey that's just wrapped up into my story and my personality.
Oh, it's lovely. So when it comes to your own maybe deconstruction from Mormonism and maybe some of the reasons, it's interesting. I think as I've worked with so many Mormon transitioners, a lot of times, there's like this historical vein, right? Or maybe there's a social justice vein, or there can be just a doesn't resonate vein. There's like a lot of different reasons why people might start kind of a deconstruction journey. But then you're studying deconstruction at large, right? So in this kind of larger capacity of people throughout the country and kind of from a more of an academic basis. So how is it being taught from that perspective as far as why do people start deconstructing and reconstructing from a theoretical space?
Yeah. So for me personally, I was doing kind of like a Terrell Givens, really nuanced Mormonism before I had kind of a bigger faith shift about a decade ago. And that was really over polygamy is kind of where that rabbit hole started, if I remember right. And at the time, there was no Lindsay Hansen Park podcast where I could just go and listen to it. And because I have a history degree, I was actually just digging through documents at night, just by myself, just trying to figure out what was going on here. And it just kind of shattered just kind of this safety in a prophet and a hierarchy and a key and all of that kind of stuff. But the deconstruction, what happens to a lot of people is that it doesn't stop there. It didn't even start there. That was just a really big blow. And then I go through a phase where I lose faith in God. And then I go through a phase where I lose kind of a sense of self and a sense of free will. And then I go through a phase where everything just seems so absurd. And sometimes when that deconstruction kind of snowball starts going down the mountain, it doesn't stop till everything's gone. Right. And eventually I really reached out to spiritual mentors because I just couldn't really grab hold onto anything, and began to find my way out of that. And that was so helpful and meaningful to my life that I wanted to learn how to do that so I could help others do that too, because I see that in so many of my friends and family members, where the deconstruction snowball goes until you're at rubble. How do you build then from there? And that's the place where I was really interested in, but because people really helped me when I was there. And then in general, deconstruction, it's multifaceted, but, losing faith in institutions as we're bumping into a global world now. And every tribe claims that they're God's special people and their rituals are the ways into heaven. We just kind of start stepping back and realize, oh, I think we're all kind of playing the same game here. Historicity can sometimes be an issue that tends to be more of an issue in Mormonism, just because we're a young religion, so we actually have more of our history than some of these older religions. But really, it's just this postmodern idea that we're realizing that as we become a global world and we all are claiming these really big truth claims, these really big stories, and now we're starting to fight over them and really kill each other and our planet over which God is true. Now, for the first time in history, we're starting to take a step back and realize, oh, maybe there's something going on that's deeper than what we thought. Maybe we're creating these gods. Maybe we're tribal. Maybe we're just starting to question for the first time. And it's really because we're becoming this global world, and we're actually able to look at history and look at one another in conversation and actually kind of see what's going on. And it's troubling at first because we are so tribal that someone across the world really believes what they believe and everybody's believing all their things. And then you just realize, well, we can't all be right. And then that starts to open up some questions about what's really going on here. And we haven't ever had to answer those questions before because we lived in a tribe. And if we found another tribe, we'd fight each other. And we didn't know about everybody else in the world. So it's the first time in history where we're able to step back and take stock about what's going on here. And that's opening a lot of well-established institutions as we begin to answer those questions.
You mentioned the recent poll, I think it's the Pew poll, right, that talked about less than half now of Americans are attending church service. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that's happened amazingly rapidly, right? I mean, just from the last time they did that poll, which was, hovering in the 70 to 80 percentile, and that number had stayed pretty steady for about 50 to 100 years, or however long.
Yeah, a long time. Yeah.
I think that there had been like a slight decrease, maybe from 90% to 70%, or over a long time.
Yeah.
But then had this drastic, kind of very, very quick and very high levels of numbers be so shifting in such high levels. It just seems incredibly surprising. So is that anything that was talked about in your studies or your program?
Yeah, a lot. We're really trying to get a sense of Gen Z spirituality. That was one of the big kind of focuses, is like adults. And I'm sure you've seen this in your work. There are times where adults can say, okay, I was raised this way and I deconstructed and reconstructed, and now I feel pretty good in my life. But I got this 16, 18-year-old kid, maybe they weren't raised in religion, or they've just had a different experience. They've grown up in a global world, which we never did. And they're not going to sit in a pew. They're just not. As a generation, they're not going to sit in a pew. So then now what do we do? Because now we see these huge reports of, yes, they're not going into church, so maybe there'll be less religious trauma, but we're seeing the opposite problem, which is this huge generation that feels anxious, disconnected, depressed. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm about. I don't know what the meaning of life is. I don't know what to grab onto here. If all we give our kids after religion is just commercialism, in some ways that's worse for mental health. And it depends, it depends on how bad your religious trauma is. But in some ways, you raising a kid and giving them no spirituality, no deeper sense of life, except for the commercials that they're constantly seeing about happiness is how we look and what you buy. And I mean, they're just dead inside and just suffering. And so what do we do? Or what is this generation going to do with this problem? And it's not something that I have all the answers on, but it's something that everyone's kind of studying, because you're right, we've had this big shift and the adults are kind of figuring it out and trying to reconstruct. But the kids of those adults are really struggling spiritually, and we haven't yet kind of disentangled spirituality from religion in order to give them something, because we're so triggered as adults from our own religious trauma. And so it's going to be really interesting to see where that leads. And I have some things that I'm watching, and I have some ideas and theories and things like that, but usually the option, this is what I advocate for, so I'll spend a minute here, but usually the option that these kids get is to return to religion. And just, I'm so scared of like trying to raise my kid outside of a community that we're just going to go to church, even though I don't believe, because I need some order and structure in my life. So that's an option. And then there's an option to kind of go towards mysticism. And so then you get into, I'm so hungry for spirituality that I'm reading tarot cards and I'm charging my crystals in the moonlight, and it becomes a little bit disconnected from science, if I may say. Some of that, right? Some of that, it just starts to get really woo-woo and really just based on our feelings without any tether to the real world. And that can be problematic. If you go into any kind of new age shop and you look at all the claims that are being made, it's like, I don't know if that's any more believable than religion, but okay. And then, or the option of just like nothing, like I'm so triggered by religion that I'm so wary of anything spiritual that we're just not going to talk about it. Those are just bad options that we're giving this new generation. And so we're having to learn how to do secular spirituality. We're having to learn how to do spirituality that isn't under the monopoly of religion. And churches are having to figure this out. Secularism is having to figure this out. Therapists are having to figure this out, because these kids are showing up in therapists' offices saying, I have no reason to live. We are all on deck for this big shift and then this big spiritual hunger that we now have.
Well, and you mentioned briefly the world. You said somewhere along the time, somewhere
in that babbledy
yeah,
gook.
you said something like, and Gen Z cares about the world. And something that I've noticed in my practice with working with some of the younger people is their hopelessness about the world even being around. And that's not something that, I remember things being scary about like famine, I remember like the big scare, when we were growing up, like eat all your food because there's people starving, on the other side of the world, or, things like that being said to us when we were growing up. But I don't necessarily remember this fear that somehow our world was just not going to exist. And so I think that, to your point, if we're going to sweep with wide brushes, 3 things that I would say are paramount for mental health, if I'm sweeping with wide brushes, would be a sense of identity of who I am, a sense of meaning of life, like I have a purpose, in regards to why I'm here, and a sense of community, like I've got people to do all of that with. So when you think about religion in general, it does that pretty well, right? And, you think about Mormonism, it's like, we are the Mormons, right? we know who we are, and we know why we're here, and we have these groups, that we call wards or stakes. And most religions kind of do that. And it's also interesting when you talk about religious trauma, I think that not all religions cause necessarily religious trauma, but I do think that high demand or more fundamental or strict religions are more apt to cause trauma, mainly because there's less flexibility, there's more rigidity, there's less ability to self-actualize, there's less ability, especially like, you mentioned your brother earlier, to self-identify, to be who you need to be a healthy individual, right? So when the box is small that you need to fit into, obviously the trauma capacity is wider. So, but there are churches out there that are quite affirming, that are quite, if you come from like a Unitarian tradition, or if you come from like a progressive Methodist tradition, or, religious
Yeah.
is probably not going to be as much in your lexicon, right?
Yeah. So we're learning kind of that there's problems on both sides. So you go too strict and it's going to break and be rigid. And if you fall from that system, it's going to hurt, because you're going to lose your identity. You're going to lose your community. You're going to lose your sense of purpose, and you're just going to be flattened for a little bit. But then on the other side, when we get into, everybody's kind of trying to figure this out. And some churches, the gate is so wide that we see them pop up for a couple of years and then they fizzle. Or we even see this with post-Mormon groups, right? I did a Sunstone presentation last year. We did a big survey on all the post-Mormon groups that are happening around the country. And we're finding that they meet and they form really deep bonds for about 2 or 3 years. And those bonds are trauma bonds. We're going to all sit and we're going to tell our story, and we're going to have some trauma bonding. But after about 3 years, unless you make your group about something else, it's going to fizzle. The bonds aren't strong enough to continue year after year. And so the problem that we're having is some groups are saying, well, I want a group of people, but I don't want it to look like religion at all. We're just going to show up and just loosely, we'll just be friends and we'll just love each other. And we're finding that unless you can really get gritty about what you're about in this group and really have it like a football team, if you get together with a football team and say, we're just going to get around together and play football once in a while. Well, if you get in a fight with someone on your team, you're just going to leave. We're going to go win the championship. It's enough to keep it going. So we're finding problems on both ends where you're either too rigid, or on the other side, we see all of these kind of secular kinds of churches or groups, and they last for a couple of years and then they fail. And so we're trying to get back as a society and individually, what's the sweet spot of community that I really care about, of a sense of identity, of values and shared values, where I'm around people who are reminding me of my shared values, even rituals, getting some rituals in there. And we're trying to figure out this big problem, which is, how do we do spirituality? How do we do church? Because churches have been incredibly helpful for humans for tens of thousands of years. How do we do that in a way that's authentic to our beliefs, especially for people who are now the nuns, the biggest religion of people who just don't identify with any kind of metaphysical story? How do we do that? We don't know yet. It's a problem that everyone's actively a part of. That's the problem of this generation.
Right. How do you get people to buy in without this shame and guilt that causes the trauma?
Yes. Or even like this group that I have now, we're going on year 4, and for the first time we're asking for money and it'll hit some triggers, because as soon as you as a group start asking for money, ooh, that feels like tithing. Ooh, I have some trauma with tithing, and we'll pull back. And so it's dealing individually and community with all of our collective religious trauma, so that we can form communities that we actually care about. Because if we don't, we're missing something. Science shows us that something like rituals, they help us process. One of my favorite rituals is in Judaism. If someone dies close to your family, this is how we wash the body. This is what we say. This is the funeral. The first week you're in mourning. If someone visits your house, you don't have to say anything. If you don't say anything first, they won't speak. And so they'll just sit in silence with you. And for a week, the community does all your jobs, does all your cooking and cleaning. And then over the next few weeks, you'll slowly be invited back into society. That's it. If someone close to you dies and you're in a state of shock, it's incredibly helpful to have these rituals, to have a schedule for people holding you in that space, but also not letting you stay there as you come back into the community. So the trick is right now is how do we pull this baby out of the bathwater? How do we extract it from some of these are the hoops you have to do to get through heaven, or you have to believe X about God? How do we remove all that but save this baby, which is, these things are really helpful and really
essential for human flourishing. And it's a hard thing for an individual and for society.
And that's probably the buy-in there, right? Is educating people on the importance for their own mental health, which then of course is tied to their physical health, right? And so hopefully that's part and why I have you on this show of Mormon mental health. Why would I have a spiritual director on Mormon mental health?
It can be a hard sell. I'll tell you what makes it a hard sell. If you've left a high demand religion or you left Mormonism, there's a while there where it's very common for kind of ex-Mormonism to become your new religion, right? These are your new prophets. Reddit is your new community. This podcast is your new scripture, right? And you feel an identity in a community with this group of people, right? And so it can be a hard sell to say to people, you know, we can't just keep switching religions. Eventually we're going to have to grow. We're going to have to transcend this a little bit. And so that can be a hard sell to tell people that you need spirituality. Sometimes it takes years because there's just so much to process, or you found a new religion in fundamental Christianity or ex-Mormonism or CrossFit or whatever your new religion is, and you don't realize for a while, I miss some things. Yeah. I miss some things from my old spiritual life, and I don't know how to get those back. And that's the space where I really like to dig in and help people, because people helped me when I was there.
And I just did a recent interview with Uplift Kids, which they're kind of, you know.
Yes, very much in this space. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, and I spent some time with him talking about spirituality. So why don't we do that? Why don't we talk about how do you define that word, right? Because I think if anybody could close their eyes and you said, okay, like brainstorm 3 or 5 words after the word spiritual, you know, what would probably come up? Oh, God, angels, halos, heaven, you know, like.
This is me like.
And then you're hyperventilating.
Triggered. I'm triggered, Natasha. You've triggered me.
So this is kind of the first thing we need to do is we kind of got to reclaim this word, or we got to redefine it. We've got to like think of it in a completely different way. We got to deconstruct spirituality.
Okay. Right? All right. Yeah. Let's do that.
Yeah. Help me think about spirituality in a way where those are not going to be the first 5 words that come up.
Yeah. Let's do that before my brain implodes. So I like the definition for spirituality as connectedness. So that would be a deep connection with yourself, in your relationships, the earth, and then humanity as a whole. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not spiritual, I would say that would be a person that is very disconnected, right? I'm just numb. I'm doing what a robot does. If you're living a life and a robot could do what you do, you get up and you brush your teeth and you go to work and type these things and you go home, you turn on Netflix, and you're just really disconnected from whatever you call the flow of life. Some people call that God, some people don't. That would be a lack to me of a spiritual life. And I'm going to offend people on both sides when I say this, but I'm just going to say it because I'm trying to claim this space, right? I'm trying to claim that we all need this. I define religion as how a person orients themselves in the universe. And I think that everyone does religion. Mm-hmm. So I would define organized religion as Mormonism and Catholicism, and these are organizations of things that you buy into. But I think that everyone does religion, because the truth is that we're born into this universe. We're not really told why. We're thrown into, it's kind of chaos, and we have all these feelings and we have these bodies, and it's just kind of a mess. And we all have to kind of find our way to order the chaos, or to organize and orient ourselves in the universe. And so when someone says, I don't do any religion, I look at their life and I say, okay, you're a CrossFit keto warrior, and you go and you love this team and you go sing with them, and that does something for you. And for your prayer time, you really enjoy meditating on Sam Harris's app, and you really love Brené Brown, and she's like a scripture for you. And I can look at their life, and you can say that you're not doing religion, but I'm looking at it all. You're singing, There's scripture, there's leaders, there's community, there's contemplation, there's quiet time, there's rituals. It's just kind of what humans do. And so my claim is that, hey, we're all kind of doing religion because we're kind of just thrown into this universe. Let's decide how the better ways to do this. And that to me is a great way to open up the conversation, because then it's not about, do you believe in God or don't you? Now religious and non-religious people in organized religion can really join in that conversation and say, these are the things that are working. And across history, these are the things that don't really work. Like when we say, I'm sure of this, when we make really big claims about ultimate reality, when we look across history, we can just recognize, oh, we're really bad at this. Maybe we can just set that aside, but we're really good at this, right? Mormons do community really well. It's an amazing, Terrell Givens calls it the sociological genius of Mormonism, to draw a square and say, love these people. Amazing, brilliant. There are tons of things that are really, really beautiful that you can bring into the conversation for Mormonism, and also things that, hey, this doesn't seem to be working out so well. And it's all a part of how do we do religion and how do we do it better? Because I think everyone does it.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And maybe a word that came up for me as you were talking about that is intentional religion, being intentional about it, understanding that drive that we all have to fill those spaces in our lived experience, day-to-day experience. Because I agree, I think that we do have these tendencies as humans. We have so much more in common, right? That we're useful.
We go off in our different places and say we don't need religion, and then someone dies. Okay, what do we do? What do we do? Well, religion has tens of thousands of years experiences of helpful things you can do as a community and as an individual. We can learn from that. We can glean from that without holding on to the things that just don't stand up in modern day science.
Yeah. There's a lot of beauty and wisdom in that. I love it. And humility. Humility in that as well. That just because we have science and modern day technological understanding doesn't mean that we don't need the wisdom of, the ancestry as well. Also, as you were talking about, this sweet spot in the middle between rigidity and chaos, I was thinking of the family therapy model. It's called the Circumplex Model, and I encourage anybody to go Google that, because that's a wonderful way to kind of see these systems and how, if you've got it too rigid and too disconnected, or too rigid and too enmeshed, and it's exactly what you were talking about, where the sweet spots, and it has these nice 4 little systems where these are kind of the healthy systems, and they're right in the middle between, rigidity and chaos and disconnected to enmeshed. And if you can find those 4 sweet spots, that's kind of what we'd consider in family systems to be healthy systems. Versus too rigid, too chaotic, versus too enmeshed, too disconnected. And so it was reminding me of what you were talking about.
Yes, this is all really a balance of order and chaos. And I really always, when I'm working with someone one-on-one, how are they ordering their chaos? Or how is the order really breaking down and inviting some more chaos that needs to be, dealt with? And it's a balance really for everyone.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so I think you've done a great job in explaining purpose here and process. So now let's move into role. So what in the heck is a spiritual director? I think this is a fairly new term. I've just been hearing it, kind of in my ethos in the last year or two. And I think it's a very interesting concept. You talked about mentors, in your life, helping you through your deconstruction and reconstructions. And so help me understand, and the public understand, kind of more of the formal role and what this, those of you who see yourselves in this particular framing, what you would want the public to know about.
Yes.
Who you are, what you do, etc.
Yes. So I've been trained with the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality. So that's where it was an 18-month program, kind of on top of the master's degree in theology. And that's pretty common for spiritual directors to have training in theology. And as I explain this, I just want to say that this umbrella of therapists, spiritual directors, teachers, life coaches, we're all doing, this is the umbrella of soul work, right? So there's going to be a lot of overlap. So the things that I say that I'm going to do are some of the things that you do too as a therapist, but our approach may be a bit different. So let's go into that. My favorite definition for spiritual director is someone who helps you write your sacred story. And so we are not therapists. And a big difference, let me go through some of the differences. So usually when someone comes in to see a therapist, there's a problem that needs to be fixed, right? There's my marriage is X, relationship problems, I have sexual trauma, that kind of thing. And so when someone comes to me with some of those issues, I'm very clear that there are some things that I don't do, I'm not trained to do. And a big part of our training is knowing when it's time to, okay, this is now bigger than my sphere and I need to refer you to a therapist. What spiritual directors really hone in on is this deep soul space, beliefs, God, meaning of my life, faith transitions, really, really deep soul work. So it's not really always related to a problem. People will often go to therapy. They'll go once a week for a couple months to kind of work on a problem. Whereas spiritual directors, they usually meet once a month, usually not more than that, because you want to kind of settle and sit with things. And it can go for years. So decades, you can do a spiritual director. They're really midwives for your spiritual growth and your spiritual transformation. And so there's no real one model that we use or tool that we're trying to teach you or belief that we're trying to get you to believe. It's really someone to hold your hand through the process of spiritual transformation. I'll just give you a concrete example. I had a client last week. She had 30 years ago put up a child up for adoption in LDS services and never told her husband, never told her children. That story was wrapped in sexual shame, and she put that on a box and she put it away. And so I was very clear with her that if she wanted to structure discussions with her family about this, that I have a great therapist to refer her to for, this therapist really does intergenerational therapy and how to have those discussions that affect generations, right? So for those things, I would refer her to a therapist. But her deep soul work and how to rewrite that story was something that I could work with her with. And so we went and we kind of told her story and all the shame that was wrapped around it, and we rewrote it. I also give blessings, like I'll sit with it and I will offer a blessing, not as a priesthood, not as a God told me to, but as someone who I've seen your soul and I'm going to offer a blessing from my soul to yours. We sit in silence, we ask questions, and it's really this understanding of this is your spiritual home. And I walk in, and because I have so much theology training and all of this training, I can see, okay, this is your foundation, and I see why this wall is here, and I see your family decorations here, and I see that wall isn't really serving you, and I'm going to help you knock it down. And it's really just spending time in someone's spiritual home and helping them DIY it to better fit their needs, and so that it's more of a home to come home to. So we just really, really focus in on that deeper soul work. And then some of how that affects relationships or other things, we often refer that to therapists, and we're very careful not to get into that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, knowing your scope of practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And which
right.
is, I think, what we as therapists too, we need to know our scope of practice.
And you are unique, Natasha, because you're a therapist who does delve into people's beliefs and religious trauma. But if you look up a therapist in a phone book, they may really not be trained in religious trauma, or they may, if you want to talk about God or a spiritual experience you had, or you want to check out Buddhism because you heard this, or you want someone to help you with a guided meditation, or you need, those kinds of things. A therapist really might not feel comfortable going into some of those places or have training for some of those places. And so that's where a spiritual director with that really strong kind of theology, deeper soul space training can go in and really help a therapist in places where even therapists can feel uncomfortable going.
And I love that you talked about that this is something that could be collaborative between a therapist and a spiritual director to work together with a client. And also, even though I am trained in religious trauma and working through religious issues, I wouldn't necessarily see my role as giving a blessing, right? That would be more of what I would consider, again, ecclesiastical role, even though you're not an ecclesiast, in that formal sense. And so if somebody was looking for that kind of more energetic work to do with somebody, or experiential work, however you want to describe that, I would refer to somebody who would do something like that. Whereas I would be more about the talk therapy piece and the therapeutic piece, but not necessarily that more ritualistic piece, that it seems like you're talking about. So
yeah, I even will develop rituals with clients and do that with them. It's really holding hands with someone on their spiritual journey. And I don't know it's like a midwife. I don't know what's going to be born, but I'm here because I've seen a lot of births before, and I had a lot of tools for these pains are turning into something. Let me help you with this process and be there with you. And so it's a little bit different of approach, but they can really go together really beautifully when therapists and spiritual directors work together.
Are you comfortable talking a little bit more about just kind of your own personal journey, feeling like you had mentors there, and how they stepped into your life, or how you reached out? Doesn't sound like maybe you necessarily had a spiritual director per se. It helped you go into that line of work, but what was that journey like for you personally, to have people?
Yeah. So I have 3, and it's important. And as a therapist, it's important for you to see your own therapist, right? And you to continue your journey. And so I have 3 spiritual mentors that I meet once in a while. They all have a different kind of approach to I just recognize that these are people that are further along on this path. And if I'm climbing this new mountain, this is new terrain, it's really nice to have a partner who understands and has some tools that can do that with me and help me see things that I'm not seeing when we get caught in these kind of thought loops. And so I still regularly see spiritual mentors. The one that really got me into this work was a Sufi. And Sufism is the mystical form of Islam. The place where I really got stuck, and when I say stuck, I mean like for a couple years got stuck, is I kept looking for the capital T truth. And this is very common for Mormons because we are taught from young children that you can find the truth and you can kind of build your life on truth. And so when Mormonism falls away or God dies or whatever, the scaffolding is still there, right? So what you'll find is Mormons often, we keep looking for a prophet because we just have this inner scaffolding of, well, if this isn't the truth, I'm going to find the truth, or I'm going to find a prophet. And then we just keep kind of doing the same patterns, but we don't notice that we're doing it because it's so ingrained. And so I had a Sufi teacher who really changed my life. Most religions do these 3 things in order. They do a story, epistemology. This is the story. Jesus, whatever. This is the commandments. Jesus said, do these things. Ethics, right? This is how you need to order your life. And these are good and bad choices. And then most religions, after you get the story and do the ethics, there's some kind of being. So this would be in Christianity, like I become a new person in Christ. I have some kind of transformation. My nature has changed, right? Being.
Born again type of thing.
Yeah, just some kind of like you get into being, right? Mm-hmm. As someone coming out of Mormonism, I still had this scaffolding of like, well, I'm just going to figure out the truth. And I just kept building kind of these towers of beliefs and then having them crumble over and over the course of, I don't know, years, right? Eventually, something deep in my body said, this pattern of how I'm trying to do this, it's not working. It's not working. I need help. And so I reached out to a couple people and just said like, hey, I'm just kind of stuck, and a Sufi teacher helped me to, most mystic traditions do the reverse. So instead of story, ethics, being, they flip it upside down and they do being first and then ethics and then story. So you start with being, and then once you really get a sense of who and what you are and what you're about and really get deeply connected to yourself, ethics comes easier. I don't want to steal from you because you are me, right? And that becomes easy. And then story, you just go to stories to play. This is just where I play. Stories is just a place I just, this is soul landscape stuff, and I just go there to play, but I don't take them literally. Mystic traditions don't take their stories literally. And so it was a switch, right? And it was a shift, and it just completely transformed my life because I was in this pattern and I just couldn't quite get out of it. And I knew that I was stuck, and I knew that I couldn't keep going the way that I was going, but I didn't know how to. This is a deep pattern, So when people say I've left Mormonism and I'm totally like, there's nothing about me that's Mormon anymore, I'm always like, it shows up. It shows up later. I still find things that I'm like, oh, there's a pattern in there that's still showing up. It still happens to me all the time, right? So having someone to really help you, okay, they see these patterns, they see how you're patterning your life, and offer you those shifts. What if we think about this? Let's do some guided meditations. Let's explore this. Here, read this and tell me what resonates with you. And gives you really homework to just get out of places where you're stuck. It was so transformative that I really wanted to learn how to do that, because I see that everybody else is in this place with me, where in the whole country, in the whole world, we're deconstructing, but we're just, how do we do life then? We just get stuck in various places. And so that Sufi teacher was really helpful. And it's a tool that I use, not Sufi specifically, but this kind of mystical approach to, wisdom tradition approach to religion can be really helpful. But often you really need a guide to help you see the patterns in yourself that you don't see because you're in it. And that's where a guide is really helpful.
No, I love that you bring up that, we take whatever we came from with us, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's just even like our parents, and even the older I get, I'm like, oh my goodness, I can feel, like, I can even feel it in my face when I start talking like my mom.
Yes.
I can feel my face looking like my mom. And my mom is great, so it's not like I hate sounding like my mom, but those things that used to annoy me, when I was younger, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just doing exactly what she used to do.
Yes. If anyone ever says like, I'm nothing like my parents and I left religion and it affects me nothing, doesn't affect me at all, and I've totally moved on, it's like, okay, call me in 5 years. Things are ingrained in us, and those guides can just really help you out of those places where you just can't see how to get out of those loops.
Right. Yeah, we're kind of in that denial phase for a minute.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, so now that I expect you to, delve into my realm of mental health, but from a mental health perspective, doing this kind of work, what can you say, either personally or even somewhat professionally? Like, how does this help people's health? How does this help people's sense of well-being? How does this help people's sense of feeling more hopeful, or, less depressed, or having less symptomology in regards to things like anxiety, or having healthier coping mechanisms, or things of that nature? So best as you can.
Yeah.
I'm inviting you to dive into my world.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll not get above my britches here and pretend to know everything that you know, but I'll speak abstractly, and then I'll give an example from a client. Often spiritual direction is talked about like therapy is a tree is dying and you have all these branches and you go in and like, I need to fix this branch, right? And spiritual direction can often be, we're going to go into the root system. And some of those problems kind of can go away on their own. And then some of them, you need a therapist to continue that work. But it's really getting into that root system, your most essential core values and beliefs and voice, and again, places where you feel stuck, and just the deepest parts of you, right? And so for mental health, so for example, I had a client this week who is in a mixed faith marriage, which you're very familiar with and you give lovely classes on. go to her website to see. There's a lot of things that you would do as a therapist, or you could do in a class to say, here's how to have these conversations, and here's some ways to think about it, and here's how we can shift this. But as I'm digging in to see what's going on with her personally, because I don't do therapy with her and the husband, I would refer that to a therapist. So I'm digging in to see what's really at the core of this, right? And at the core of it was her husband says that he knows, I know this is true. I know this. I believe this about God. And so she felt so small in her home and in her marriage because there's no place for her, but she couldn't get into that place because she had this belief that if he knows and I don't, who am I to say anything? How can I say to my children anything about spirituality when I don't know, right? Okay, I got, like, it took a while, but I got to that core belief that's driving her behavior there. And so we worked on, well, what would it look like to model a different kind of spirituality, one where you don't know? What would it look like to talk to your kids about mystery? What would it look like to tell your kids what you know and what you don't know, and what your values are and what you're not sure about? And really helping her shift from, I don't know, so I can't say anything, to I can say something even when I don't know. And in fact, there's a real beauty and gift to your children to model what spiritual life looks like, even when things are very mysterious and you don't know. That could be really beautiful. It's a beautiful gift to give to your children. And so that may help her mixed faith marriage as she's finding her voice, and then can begin to claim her space in her marriage and her home. So she feels like in her home, the spirituality of her and her husband are both represented. That may help that. She may have to go to further therapy to kind of structure those conversations. But as a spiritual director, I was really digging into what's going on with her, right? What shifts can I help her with that are at the core of this, that then maybe we'll solve some of these, other issues, or maybe, we can dig into later with a therapist. But it was that shift that was really stopping her progress and helping her model, what does spirituality look like when you allow it to be mysterious, and helping her through some of that language and some of that shifting. I'm excited to work with her as that moves forward and see how it affects her marriage.
I love that. That's a great example, because you're exactly right. In my mixed faith marriage class, I'm talking about how they both have a right to parent.
Yes.
And how they both have a right to be spiritual leaders in their homes, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the transitioners like, huh? And even the believers like, huh? How are they going to be a leader if they don't believe
yes.
anything? Right?
Yes.
So I think exactly what you're doing is helping them find new ways to consider that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And a spiritual director is really trained on finding that one belief that's stopping your spiritual transformation into this place. And that was the belief that was really holding her back, was I can't speak if I don't know for sure. Okay, let's work with that.
Right.
Yeah. And that will eventually, hopefully, help, the effects of that as she's making that shift and coming into her own voice. Does it affect your mental health when you feel like you're represented at home and in your marriage? 100%. 100%. Yeah.
Exactly. If you're feeling small and like what you have to say isn't of worth, or what you have to offer isn't of value, that's going to
100%
lead to depression. It's could potentially lead to anxiety. It can lead obviously to relational issues.
Yeah, there was anxiety because she was reading books. I got to figure out what to say, what do I believe, so that I can tell my children. So it's like this kind of worth. I have to prove my worth here so that I can show up in this place. And so, there was depression, there was anxiety, there was feeling small, there was hopelessness. And so those shifts can be really helpful. So what I do and what I talk about with depression especially is that some depression is really based on your serotonin levels, and you need to go see a therapist who's going to tell you about vitamin D and sunshine and medication and take you through that whole process. And I'm not qualified to do any of that, and I don't get into any of that. But there's some depression that's, I'm so tired of this role I have to play, and I don't know how to do it otherwise. That's an existential depression. That's a depression that I'm tired of playing this character, and I'm so tired that I don't even want to go on anymore. That's a soul depression. So I actually would play in that space, but I wouldn't in the other. And so I have to be very clear with clients, what I can and can't do. But sometimes we'll find that when you clear up some of that existential depression, some of the kind of overall depression will lessen or even go away because it wasn't a serotonin issue, it was a soul issue. And sometimes they're linked and sometimes they're separate, and but it definitely affects your mental health.
Yeah, no, well, stories, our psychology has a huge impact. What we believe, what we think, what we are telling ourselves, and what we believe about our spirituality has a huge impact on how we treat ourselves or think about ourselves. So I think those two things are inextricably connected. I think for a long time, mental health tried to divorce itself from spirituality. I think when I was going through my training 25, almost 30 years ago, it was starting to try to come back in, like, oh, maybe you should ask your clients about like their religion, whether or not they consider themselves spiritual. Maybe that should be something a therapist should ask their client. Mm-hmm. Imagine that. So we were kind of in that space of, kind of reintegrating spirituality with therapy. And so I'm glad. And yet I still think that this role that you're speaking of is something apart from even a therapeutic role. So I love that you're doing this work. So if somebody's interested in getting in touch with somebody like you or you yourself, talk about how do people find somebody like you, and then of course please help us know more about your practice and
So I podcast with Bill Reel once a week, and we do a podcast called Almost Awakened, and that is a podcast in comparison to some of his other podcasts, which God bless him, he's still digging into Mormon history, and I just have lost interest. I not lost interest. Every once in a while I'll think, okay, I think now I know everything about Mormonism, and then Lindsay will bring something up and it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So once in a while
on TikTok, I'm just going to say this.
Yes.
On TikTok today, I found out that the founders of the Friend magazine were two women who are possibly Mormon lovers.
Oh, see?
That they talked about
just once you think
and how they there's all this like stuff about how they had profound love between themselves.
If that is true, even if it's just a legend at this point, that is just so wonderful.
It's a lovely legend.
That tickles me beyond belief. So yeah, I don't do a lot with Mormon history anymore. I used to, and I don't anymore. But every once in a while, it just pulls me back in. So this podcast that Bill Reel and I do, we actually don't discuss Mormonism at all. The whole podcast is about, okay, what's next? Okay. So for example, this week we interviewed Bart Campolo. He is son of Tony Campolo, who was kind of the major American televangelist, spiritual advisor to the Clintons. And his son went through a very public deconstruction and now is a secular humanist chaplain and talking about kind of the things that we're talking about here, which is what's next. So we interviewed him this week. So conversations like that. So I do that podcast and I encourage you to check it out. There's lots of great stuff that we go over. And then my website is nnspirituality.com, and you can find ways to contact me and ask me about coaching. And then my email is nnspirituality@gmail.com. And I'm just all about, that's kind of my tagline is let's do spirituality, no nonsense spirituality, no nonsense required. You do not have to believe things that are crazy in order to have a flourishing and spiritual human life. And that's kind of what I'm about.
I love that. We'll make sure and, tag all of these things that you're talking about on the website for sure. So, well, is there anything that I have not asked you about that you were hoping to make sure you had covered? I think that we did a fairly good job, and what you shared, I think, was awesome as far as your kind of what you're about.
I can't think of anything, but I just always enjoy chatting with you and enjoy all the work that you're doing. You're just out there helping so many people, and I have not been excommunicated yet. I almost have like this secret goal of like, maybe one day I'll be annoying enough that I'll be excommunicated. From all of us who are really just watching that journey, just thank you for doing that so vulnerably and so publicly, and kind of inviting us into that journey too. And just thank you from all of us, and you're just doing such amazing work, and like all the great prophets before you, kind of being stoned from your community in order to do that work, and all of us are appreciative of it.
Oh, thank you, Brittney. That's so lovely for you to say that. Do you want to talk at all about the Post-Mormon group that you help run in Boise, and the gathering that you're about to have in March?
Yeah. So if you're in Boise, you can find me on Facebook and come find me. It's a private group, and it really started about 3.5 years ago now, where we had an event with Thomas McConkie, where he came up and kind of did a retreat up here. And then we kind of looked around at each other and just said, like, we need this, like, we need something. And so we just kind of started a community. For COVID, we would meet once a month. And at the beginning, it was a lot of just kind of trauma bonding, or what do you think about this, or having a topic, and we'd come and talk about it. And over time, some of those mixed faith marriages, now they're both out, or usually that transition only goes one way. And so there's probably more people that are out than active at this point. And so we just kind of started looking around at each other and just said, nobody's going to come for the next 20 years just to talk about polygamy again. Like, where is this going? And so we started inviting, meditators and people from other religions, and we just started to really do, like, we had a pagan night with like just women, a pagan night, and we have social events, and we just started to really explore, like, okay, let's explore together and keep doing spirituality. And so it's still going. It's one of the few post-Mormon groups that after 3 years is still going. It's something I'm really proud of. They've become my best friends in some ways, because even though we don't talk a lot about surface things, how your kid's doing and this kind of stuff, we've done this deep work together, right? And so it just creates these really strong bonds. And so we're continually, inviting resources into our group as we continue to explore spirituality outside of Orthodox Mormonism. So next month, we're hoping to have John DeLynn and some people from Thrive, and of course, and you also, to come. We've had a lot of new members over COVID who kind of stopped going to church through COVID, and then either as an opportunity to kind of silently step away, or maybe they realized that they felt more peaceful, or whatever the reason was during COVID, it felt like a good time to step away, but feeling like they still need a spiritual community, because you lose a lot. I'm in Boise, which has a high, amount of Mormons, just like Utah. So we're really excited to have John DeLynn, and hopefully you next month, to come give us some deconstruction resources, mixed faith marriage resources, relationship resources. I get people joining the group just still every week, because this is just a heavy Mormon area, and we're really excited to keep providing resources for the people who are kind of newly deconstructed, but also provide, and not all of our people who have been attending a long time will attend those, but then also not just deconstruction resources, but also explorations.
Longer term, right?
Yeah, longer term exploration. So we're trying to, it's an experiment. It may fail, but it's an experience. It's an experiment of, can we hold both of these together, and create a new community that way. So we're experimenting and trying to figure it out too. And my also invitation to anyone listening, if you're looking around and you just think, gosh, I would really love that. It happened because I looked at someone else and said, I would really love that. And then you realize, oh, maybe that person has to be me, right? And so if that's you, start a book club, find a friend, say, let's go explore something. Let's go to this Buddhist whatever, let's try this. It's been one of the most rewarding things in my life, and really one of my just most sacred things in my life, is to find people who still want to explore and do deep exploration and show up authentically and practice these things. And if you're looking around and you realize there's not that where you are, just make it.
Wow.
And it was scary and it was hard, and I'm figuring it out, but it is one of the most rewarding things in my life, and something that gives me a lot of joy.
I love that, Brittney. And I love that you did that. And I'm on the board of Thrive. And this is kind of our goal too, is to kind of help people like you start communities, in their small spaces so that they can be successful at these longer term support groups, right? That aren't just about that initial, like you call it trauma bonding.
Yeah.
That can be a good way to start, but it's not what you want to keep doing for the rest of your 10 years.
It's like, hey, polygamy bothered you too? Oh, we're best friends. And then 10 years later, it's like, I don't want to keep talking about this anymore. I can't do this anymore.
That's right. So anyway, so that resource is at thrivebeyondreligion.com. And there we have like a map where you can look to see if there's other people around you. But if there's not, like you said, Brittney, you can say, well, maybe I'll be that person, right? That gets something started in my community. And
be that person. It'll be one of the most rewarding things that you do. And we're so grateful for Thrive. And there's a couple others, but for Mormonism, Thrive is such a big one, and Uplift Kids also is we don't need to, each one of us trying to figure this out. We don't need to be recreating the wheel,
Right.
Let's learn from each other and figure out what's working and what's not. And so we appreciate Thrive coming up and kind of helping us with that. So.
Yeah, and supporting each other. And then for mixed faith resources, the Marriage on a Tightrope with Alan and Katie Mount, that's a great resource. And we're going to start a workshop, an online thing here in February. So
awesome.
On that. Brittney,
all right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on. I loved hearing you. You have such an eloquence with all the way that you're talking about this. And I think hopefully we can say spirituality, gung ho. We can do this in a healthy way that feels authentic to us, and that we can help ourselves and our children in these really important forms of having purpose in life, having community, having identity, and taking the best of where we come from with leaving the worst behind. So
it's a beautiful toast. If I had a drink, I would raise my glass. It's a beautiful toast. We'll hopefully see you in Boise next month, Natasha. It's been
good. I'm planning on it. Thank you.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Jesus,
Savior, pilot me.
when at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear